it can be associated with other symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying.
Yes.
And the typical list of symptoms include things like a very strong sense of presence. Even if you can't see or hear anything else, you are sure there is something or someone in the room with you. You know, typically you're lying there in bed, you can't move, and there's something in there that has evil intentions towards you. But you might actually hallucinate stuff.
But I think it's very serious because what you do, honestly, can help so many people. For example, in the South Asian community, there's so many charlatans. There's so many people that pretend to be these God-gifted individuals that can see their relatives, they can see dead people, they can foretell the future. There's so many people that are pretending to be this when really they're just very clever psychologists.
Well, and I mean, one study that was really worrying was actually convincing people that during their teenage years they'd been involved in a crime which had had police involvement and they were the perpetrator. And obviously people go, yeah, most people start saying, no, that didn't happen. And by the time you've put them through this procedure, a sizable minority are saying, yeah, I remember that now, which is scary.
Well, I bring this up because I've had a near-death experience.
Essentially, anomalistic psychology is focused on seeing if we could come up with alternative, non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences.
Chris, welcome to the Appauling Podcast. I just want to say, so this is episode number 11, and thus far I've done 10 episodes, and I'm proud to say I haven't used a single note. No piece of paper has touched this table. But today, I am acutely aware that I am sitting in front of a psychology professor, someone who founded the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit.
Very good.
The Department of Goldsmiths, University of London, which is just amazing. And I'm so honored to have you on the show. So, Chris, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So can you just explain, before we begin, what is animalistic psychology? And have I said it right?
You have said it right, yeah. And it's always the question that comes first. Essentially, anomalistic psychology is focused on seeing if we could come up with alternative, non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences. I mean, there's no doubt at all that people have some very, very strange experiences. And a lot of the time they are interpreted by people as it must be paranormal. But I'd say a lot of the time, if not all of the time, we can actually come up with plausible other explanations, usually in terms of psychology. So things like the things we're kind of interested in are the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, false memories, hallucinatory experience, and a whole range of cognitive biases that we all suffer from. But these are things that might give alternative explanations as to why people develop and maintain paranormal beliefs.
Oh, wow. See, that is, for me, I am a big advocate of everything you've just explained, but I know nothing about it. So I'm a rebel without a clue. I'm constantly telling people that, no, I don't think you saw what you saw. No, I think it's a false memory. But whenever I have to go to the next step and people say, well, can you explain that? That's it. I'm not. So my reasons for having you on, Chris, are very, very selfish. I'm hoping you can just give me all the ammunition I need.
I will indeed.
So if we can just touch upon your book, first of all.
Yeah.
What was your book called?
Well, again, I gave you quite a wordy definition of anomalistic psychology there. But what I sometimes do, especially during talks, is to say, or in fact, it's just the science of weird shit.
I love it.
That is the title of the book. It started off as a joke.
Yeah.
I was going to call it originally Why Weird Stuff Matters, which I still think is a pretty good title.
Yeah.
But then to a few friends, I just said, I might just call it The Science of Weird Shit. And almost without exception said, I'd buy that. So I didn't know whether the publisher would go for it because it's MIT Press, very respectable publisher. But yeah, they loved it. So
really?
That's what it's ended up as being. Well, just to emphasize this, I don't want it to come across as if I'm being very dismissive of people's experiences, which was a bit of a worry with that title.
Yeah.
Because I'm not. I take these experiences very seriously.
Yeah.
There's not a single society anywhere in the world or any time in history where people haven't reported these kinds of weird experiences. And so, there's only two possibilities. Either some of them genuinely are paranormal, and if that's the case, well, that's amazing. It'd be an amazing scientific breakthrough to to prove that that was the case. But if they're not, and the wider scientific community is very skeptical about paranormal claims, if that skepticism is well placed, then it's telling us something really fundamental about human psychology. So either way, it's worth taking those kinds of experiences seriously and seeing if we can get to the bottom of them.
No doubt. It's such a serious subject because when we look at it, we think paranormal activities, we think the haunted, we think about all these things, and we have a little bit of a joke. We mock it a little bit. But I think it's very serious because what you do, honestly, can help so many people. For example, in the South Asian community, there's so many charlatans. There's so many people that pretend to be these God-gifted individuals that can see their relatives, they can see dead people, they can foretell the future. There's so many people that are pretending to be this when really they're just very clever psychologists.
Well, a lot of the time that is true. I mean, also, I think some of the time they genuinely do believe what they're saying. So, I mean, again, I'm not particularly au fait with how things work out in your community.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do know kind of, our kind of native mediums. A lot of them genuinely believe they've got a gift, but there are charlatans. And again, there's another element to anomalistic psychology. There's that kind of consumer protection angle, just to get people to realize that there are charlatans out there. There's a technique which you can buy books on, you could learn for yourself if you didn't have any morals. A technique called cold reading, whereby you can fool complete strangers that you know all about them. And it can be incredibly effective. And obviously, if you wanted to set yourself up as a fake psychic or, some other kind of mystic, it's a very, very useful skill to have. But it doesn't involve any kind of real paranormal powers. It's all about, it's a whole set of different techniques. I mean, I used to joke to my students, I retired in 2020, but I used to teach a course on anomalistic psychology, and I would tell them all about cold reading. I'd say, so if you've got these skills, if you can't get a job after you graduate, you've got something to fall back on. So the next generation of psychics will all be my students that pass through Goldsmiths.
That's brilliant. Again, for example, the pushback that I get when I'm trying to challenge, or sometimes not even challenge, sometimes I'm trying to question. That's all I want to do is just question it. And I always say, like, people have spent their life savings on some of these, for example, charlatans. Yeah. People have been taken advantage of. And I always try and say to them that, hang on a second, let's just make sure you understand the science behind it. Yeah. And a thing that I get a pushback is that scientist didn't go through what I went through, or they will say, oh, they don't know what I saw. Yeah. Do you get that?
That's it. Well, again, it's perfectly understandable. I think for most people, when it comes to sources of evidence, the most fundamental source of evidence that anybody can think of is their own personal experience. And I do get that. But as a psychologist, I know that your own personal experience and my own personal experience and everybody's personal experience can be faulty. We misperceive things, we misremember things, we misinterpret things. And, I think as a psychologist, as somebody who's interested in these kinds of topics, I've got lots of examples that I could give you of where that happens. But it is still the case that at the end of the day, we all found our own experience. Oh, no, I can't be wrong. No, I saw this with my own eyes. I'll sometimes hear skeptics saying, well, I don't believe in ghosts or UFOs or whatever because I've never seen one. And my comeback on that would be, even if you thought you had seen one, you're just as prone to these kinds of biases and misperceptions, et cetera, as anybody else.
Yeah.
So we need better proof than just anecdotes. And that's really a lot of the time what we're dealing with. And that's why the study of memory is so central to this stuff, because usually we're actually dealing with someone's report of what they say they've experienced, what they've witnessed. We're not dealing with the experience or the event itself. There's something that's happened in the past. And so the unreliability of eyewitness testimony is something there's been literally thousands of studies of. We know that people misremember things. We know that under certain conditions people misperceive things. We know under certain conditions people see things that aren't there. There's a whole range of psychological phenomena that are relevant here. And what anomalistic psychologists try to do is to say, well, okay, let's see if we can come up with an alternative explanation for this particular phenomenon, whatever it may be. And wherever possible, can we run experiments that actually test our ideas to see whether they are supported by evidence? And very often you can do that. Set up a well-controlled study where you know exactly what's happening, and you can show that people will report seeing things happen that didn't happen. People will misremember stuff. People will develop false memories and so on.
Well, chapter 10, now that you talk about it, is one of my favorite chapters because that's exactly what you do. And you come with receipts, Chris. So when you actually, you go ahead, and what I like is you're not just point blank saying, no, this is not true. You're very empathetic. And with your the way you explain critical thinking as well, you're not explaining to people, this is what you should think. You're trying to explain to people, this is how you should think.
Well, that's it. That's what is so crucially important. And again, for me, a central part of what I see as proper skepticism is being open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
Yeah.
If you ask me now, do I believe in telepathy, clairvoyance, people being abducted by aliens, etc., I'd say no. I don't, but I accept that I could be wrong, and that maybe somebody will come along with some really tight proof in the future.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, well, I hope I'd be big enough to swallow my pride.
Yeah.
I mean, I accept that as a kind of somebody who's known as being a skeptic. I'd find it a bit embarrassing. It means you've been wrong all these years, mouthing off. But I'd hope that I'd get to a point where I can say, okay, I was wrong, and this is a really amazing finding, and we've made real progress scientifically by realizing that. But to date, I mean, the stuff that we've done in terms of empirical research, there's two main strands to it. One of them is kind of the stuff we've been talking about so far, where we are focusing on what looks like it's paranormal, but it isn't, and so that's one strand. But in line with this notion that I might be wrong, we also directly test paranormal claims. And again, there's a couple of chapters in the book which describe some of the tests that we've done over the years. And in any of those tests, we could have got results that made me say, oh, wow, I wasn't expecting that, But so far it hasn't happened. I get a little bit annoyed when people kind of accuse, well, me in particular, but skeptics in general, of being closed-minded. Right. They say, oh, you're so closed-minded, I'm open-minded, I believe in all this stuff. No, you can be too open-minded,
yes, of course.
If you're so open-minded that your brains fall out, But for me, properly being open-minded is to be able to say what evidence would prove to you that some of the things you believe are wrong. Can you say what that evidence is? And generally, I can. I can tell you what would convince me that telepathy is real. Well, a robust, reliable demonstration that is replicable and carried out under properly controlled conditions. And a whole host of others. Whereas if you say to the true believer, what would convince you that you're wrong? They'll say, nothing. I know I'm right. That's being closed-minded.
That is
being closed-minded.
Can you, off the top of your head, run through an experiment that you've done in the past and give me the results of what you actually found? Something that really stuck in your mind.
I mean, one of my favourites related to a guy called Uri Geller, which people of my generation will definitely remember. People of your generation may not be familiar with. This was somebody who appeared on the scene in the UK back in the 1970s. I was a believer in all this stuff then, and I was very excited when this guy appeared because he claimed that he had amazing psychic powers. He could do all kinds of stuff. He could, for example, he could read minds, obviously, but he could also divine the contents of sealed envelopes. He claimed he could do all kinds of amazing things. But the thing that really seemed to catch the public imagination was that he said that he could bend metal using his psychic powers. And so a typical kind of demonstration would be he'd have a spoon, he would gently stroke the spoon, and it would apparently just go, bleh.
Okay.
And this supposedly was being done using paranormal powers. Now, I was really excited at the time. I was taken in hook, line, and sinker. I totally believe this. And I wanted it to be true. It was really exciting. Now, I've now got lots of friends who are conjurers. And they can do this trick, but they say it's a trick. In fact,
keyword trick.
Exactly. There are lots of different ways of achieving this effect. And yeah, as I say, they say that if Uri is doing it using psychic powers, he's doing it the hard way, because it looks exactly the same when you do it as a trick, just using sleight of hand. Some people kind of pushed back on that and said, well, no, that can't be true, because I've seen him do it live. And the thing was that after he had finished bending the spoon, he put it down on the table and it carried on bending when he wasn't even touching it. So how do you explain that, Mr. Smarty Pants skeptic? Well, a friend of mine, Professor Richard Wiseman, he is not only a member, he's not only a skeptical psychologist, he's also a member of the inner magic circle. Not even just the magic circle, the inner magic circle.
The inner.
He knows his stuff. And he assumed that this was down to the power of suggestion. So he carried out a neat little study, basically, where they show a video of an alleged psychic, who is in fact a conjurer using sleight of hand, doing a spot of this psychokinetic metal bending. And in one condition, after the key, in this case, has been bent, the psychic, who is a conjurer, says, if you look closely, you'll see it still bending. And the other condition is exactly the same, but they don't get that suggestion. That's edited out. Of those who get the suggestion, about 40% report that they thought the key carried on bending. It's a massive effect with a really simple manipulation.
Wow.
It shows the power of suggestion. In the other condition, virtually nobody does. And so Richard had kind of demonstrated that. We were interested in a phenomenon called memory conformity. And this is a situation where one person's account of something might influence another person's memory. Again, one of my colleagues at Goldsmiths, Professor Fiona Gabbert, has done a lot of research on this in a forensic context where, again, it's hugely important, eyewitnesses to a crime. The thing is, if you witness something unusual and you're in a group, you are likely to discuss it together before anybody formally interviews you.
Of course. Yeah.
And, if you've got one person who is very confidently giving an account, but it's got errors in it, that can actually contaminate other people's memories. So they end up repeating your errors. And of course, it seems then to the investigators that, oh, that's the way it really was. So we were interested in looking at this in an anomalistic context. So what we did was to borrow the same video that Richard had used, but we got our participants to watch the video in pairs. This was something I did with Chrissy Wilson, who was my PhD student at the time.
Okay.
And what the real participants in the study didn't know was that the other person in the pair was a Confederate working with us. And what we asked them to do, we said, we want you to watch this video, then discuss together what you've seen, and then report back to us independently what you have seen. And as I say, one of them was a Confederate. So that Confederate, during the discussion, would either say, yes, it did carry on bending, or no, it didn't. And what we found was that had an additive effect. So if you were in the condition in the study where you got both the suggestion from the psychic and you got the reinforcement from the co-witness, we got up to levels of 60% of people saying, yes, they thought the key carried on bending. Absolutely doesn't. You can put a ruler on the screen and you can see, no, it's not doing it. Nothing's happening here. But, and what that illustrates, it's something that we already knew from the kind of wider study of memory, but it's not just what's happening while you witness an event that can influence your memory. It's also stuff that happens afterwards. You can change people's memories. You can distort them in various ways. So, again, it was a kind of it's one thing for me to have thrown that out as a plausible explanation, but to actually demonstrate it with real data, with real participants, I think is much more powerful.
That's so much more powerful, and that's conclusive.
I would have thought so.
I would think so as well. Yeah. For me, I was a big believer in everything, and I was so not naive, but I was like, yes, all these things can happen, do happen. They just haven't happened to me yet. Until I came across the James Randi, yes. When I found out, for those people that don't know, this is an experiment. I'm not sure how old it goes back. You're familiar with the James Randi, aren't you?
Yeah, oh yeah. When I first discovered the joys of skepticism, which was, I went through all the way through doing my first degree and I was still a believer. It was only when I was doing a PhD in a completely different area, a much more scientifically respectable area, as we said, that somebody recommended a particular book to me. And it was the first skeptical treatment of this kind of stuff that I'd ever come across. And there were lots of references in that book to this person called James Randi, who I'd never heard of before. And by the time I'd kind of, after a few decades of doing this stuff, I got to the point where, I actually knew Randy as a personal friend.
Wow.
We were on hugging terms. So, we see him at conferences and so on.
That's amazing.
And he was amazing. That was his stage name, the Amazing Randy. He started off as a conjurer, but really became more widely known as a kind of debunker of charlatans and psychics and so on. And for a very long time, he had $1 million on offer for anybody who could demonstrate psychic powers under properly controlled conditions. And one of the aspects of this was that before you could go for the formal $1 million challenge, you had to pass a preliminary test that was set up and carried out by people that Randy and colleagues knew and trusted. So we would end up doing a lot of those preliminary tests. And of course, nobody ever passed them. So they never had to do any work over in Florida. We did all the work.
Yeah.
But it was, again, really interesting. At the moment, I'm afraid there's only a measly $500,000 on offer. Oh. So I can understand why, nobody's interested.
No one's interested.
No, actually, even now we're still kind of putting people through. We design a test in collaboration with them, and we get them to usually get them to sign something in advance to say this is a fair test of my claims. They come along, they do the test, they fail the test, and then they decide it wasn't actually a fair test after all. And that's the standard pattern for all of these things. But so it goes.
That is incredible. I mean, for me, that was it. When I saw that, I realized straight away, hang on a second, no one's even got past the preliminary testing. Yeah. Never mind gone for the actual big prize.
Yeah.
What does that say? I mean, please don't tell me that no one wants the money.
Well, exactly. That's what is often said. Oh, we're not interested in money. Well, there are a load of charities that would really, really appreciate that 100%. Money. You'd be doing a lot of good. You know?
Win it for them.
Not to mention the fact that obviously, if any of this stuff is real, as I say, it would bring about a revolution in mainstream science, 100%. Which is kind of quite important.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, but no, they're not interested.
Let's go back to false memories.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, the pushback that I get is people will say, well, I know what I saw, but why, Chris, are our memories so unreliable?
Again, often in the kind of experimental psychology literature, there's a kind of separation between lots of very valuable research on the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, and that is a situation where you you make errors in terms of your memory for things that you have actually witnessed. And then the false memory research is a kind of strand of research whereby we can actually implant memories for things that never actually happened at all. So, you can think of them conceptually as separate, but obviously, really, it's on a continuum. If you had a memory in your head that you and I had gone to see Star Wars at the cinema together, and in actual fact, you didn't go with me, you went with somebody else, would you call that a distorted memory of something that really did happen, or is it a false memory because you never went to the cinema with me?
That's right.
So, it doesn't really matter as long as you're aware of the fact that there is this continuum. Now, the reason that memory can be very unreliable to the extent of sometimes you think you've had an experience you haven't actually had is because memory is a reconstructive process. Every time you remember something, memory does not work like a video camera. That must have been said so many times by psychologists, but it's totally true. A lot of people, you can find this in kind of survey data, believe that memory records every single detail of everything you've ever experienced. And okay, you might not always be able to remember all those details, but they are there somewhere stored inside. Well, they're not. Every time you remember something, you are reconstructing the memory on the basis of fragments of real memory traces that are more or less accurate. But there are always gaps There are always gaps, and often you're filling in those gaps with what you think must have happened, rather than necessarily what actually did happen. I mean, if I'm doing talks on this, I kind of illustrate this by saying that, and I think it's a kind of nice everyday example. If you ask people, how is the 4 represented on clocks and watches with Roman numerals on them? Is it I, or is it IV? And I can guarantee that the majority of the audience will say IV.
IV, yeah.
And it's not IV. It's I, but only on clocks and watches. But, what it does illustrate is that you can't just kind of think back to the last time you saw a clock or a watch with Roman numerals on and zoom in on the 4. You answer in terms of what you think you must have seen.
Yes.
And usually 4 in Roman numerals is IV. But almost always on clocks and watches, it isn't. And so it's a kind of nice everyday example. But we do that in all kinds of other contexts as well. So we answer in terms of, oh, well, yeah, that must have been what happened. And then, we can end up then having a vivid memory that corresponds to what we think must have happened rather than what actually did happen. Now, that goes a long way to explaining the general unreliability of eyewitness testimony. But then it became really important to see how susceptible we are to entirely false memories, because back in the 80s and 90s, particularly in the States, but also over here and all around the world, there was a whole spate of people going in for therapy for very common psychological problems, things like anxiety, depression, eating disorders, low self-esteem, the list goes on. With no memories of ever being the victims of childhood sexual abuse. But by the time the therapy was finished, they were convinced that they had been sexually abused, typically at the hands of their own parents. And what's more, they now had detailed memories to back that up. And so the big question was, are these true memories of something that did happen, or might they be false memories? And so the only kind of silver lining to come out of this horrible situation was it generated a lot of interesting research. And so, and fast forward to today, we now have several different methods that can be used to pretty reliably implant false memories into volunteer subjects. Obviously, you couldn't implant any horrendous false memories in like the kind I've just been talking about.
Yeah.
But again, the techniques differ. The type of false memories differ from kind of fairly trivial stuff like getting you to report that a word was on a list that you were presented with when in fact that word wasn't on the list. That's interesting but fairly trivial, up to and including memories for whole events that just never happened. And the kind of techniques that you'd use there would be if you get your volunteer participants in and you tell them that you're interested in autobiographical memory. That's your memory for things that have happened to you, and particularly childhood autobiographical memory. So here's 4 things that we know happened to you as a child because we've been in touch with your mum and dad, and they've told us 3 of these things genuinely did happen to you as a child. 1 of them, as far as we know, as far as your mum and dad know, didn't. And I mean, the original study looking at this was getting lost in a shopping mall when you're about 5 years old, being very upset, and then being reunited with your mum and dad. And if people kind of obviously often will say, well, no, I don't remember that. You say, well, go away and think about it and come back in a week's time and we'll see if you've remembered more. Get them to do that a couple of times and you'll get, again, it varies depending on the technique, et cetera, but often around about a quarter, a third of people will report that they can now remember this thing. And sometimes they're adding in all sorts of extra details that weren't even there in the original scenario that you gave them. Now, other studies have used similar techniques to implant false memories for things like being attacked by a wild animal when you were a kid, or knocking over the punch bowl at a family wedding onto the bride and bride's parents, I mean, one study that was really worrying was actually convincing people that during their teenage years, they'd been involved in a crime which had had police involvement and they were the perpetrator. And obviously people go, most people start saying, no, that didn't happen. And by the time you've put them through this procedure, a sizable minority are saying, yeah, I remember that now, which is scary. So there's all sorts of ethical implications of this
terrifying
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is truly terrifying, because really, if someone knows what they're doing and someone can really practice this, for example, I would assume another technique would be hypnosis.
Hypnosis is again, a lot of people think that hypnosis, we've seen it in the movies, we've seen it on TV. People think that hypnosis is a way of recovering memories that were either hidden or repressed or just forgotten. In actual fact, it's a very, very good way to generate false memories. You put people through this deeply relaxed state. You get them to kind of imagine something. They're picturing it in their mind's eye. And in that state, it feels very real. It feels like it's a real memory. So when they kind of come out of that state, they've still got the memory. And they're convinced that, yeah, this is something that really did happen to me. So the context of this, obviously, apart from the kind of therapies that we were talking about earlier, which often use hypnosis, but you've also got people who think they might have been abducted by aliens. Yeah. And again, they often use hypnotic regression. And if you go in with the expectation that you think, yeah, I think I probably was, abducted by aliens, it would explain a lot of weird stuff in my life, then there's a very good chance that you will end up with detailed memories that you didn't have before, or also past life regression, taking people apparently back into a past life where they might have been, I don't know, Henry VIII or Cleopatra or whoever. And again, it can feel very, very real. So, and there's no doubt at all that, hypnosis makes you very susceptible to false memories.
When you said we don't play things back like a movie, like a clip, like a memory. When I recall a memory, I'm literally trying to watch what I saw in my mind. Yeah. But we piece them together in the gaps and we reconstruct it. Does our environment, for example, movies, things we see, does that affect it?
Yeah. You can end up incorporating something that you've seen in a movie. You can end up thinking that you've actually experienced it yourself, and there's loads of examples of that. One of the more recent areas of research, which fascinates me, is research into what are called non-believed memories. Now, these are memories which you have in your head, or at least feel like memories, but you yourself have decided that cannot be something that really happened. So, strictly speaking, they're not false memories. For it to be a false memory, you have to believe it really did happen. Yeah. These are they were false memories, but you've actually, for some reason, decided, no, that can't have happened. And the reasons that people give for deciding that these things were events that didn't really happen, again, there's a whole range. Sometimes it might be that you just decided, well, that's just impossible. That can't have happened. I did a really interesting project with an artist friend of mine where we just got people to send us we actually said, send us your false memories, because if we would have said, send us your non-believed memories, nobody would know what we're talking about. But send us your false memories, either yours or your friends, your family. And we got a really big response to this. This was done with the Wellcome Trust. And some of them were great. There are people saying, no, I've got a really clear memory. I was a little kid. I was walking down the road, holding my mum's hand, and a dinosaur crossed the road in front of us. I know it didn't happen, but I've got the memory. Yeah. It feels just as clear as any other memory. There was another one that I really liked. Was I remember I was sitting in the child seat in the back of the car. I could see the back of my dad's head as he was driving along, and suddenly he turned round while the car was still moving and said, "I won't be a minute." Opened the door and jumped out while the car was still moving. So I'm rolling along on the grass verge. And then a couple of minutes later, he was back inside the car. I can't remember how he got in. and again, these are people who say, I know this did not happen. But it might have been that you dreamt it. It might have been that it was something you saw in a film. It could have been all sorts of things. Yeah. Often people will sometimes borrow other people's. Apparently, it's quite big in identical twins. About 20% of identical twins report that at some stage, one of them has been talking about something and the other one said, that didn't happen to you. That was me. That happened to me.
Wow.
And I it happened with my mum. My mum had Alzheimer's, and she suddenly began talking about when she used to do athletics in great detail. But she'd never mentioned this before in all the decades we'd known her. And one of my sisters did do athletics, and it looked like she was probably kind of basing what she was saying on what her daughter had experienced. But you'd have been totally convinced. I mean, because there were times when even I was thinking, I wonder if she really did,
because the detail is so great.
But
yeah.
it'd never been mentioned before, so we were pretty convinced that.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
With this idea of, I don't know if you know about this, but like on an evolutional example, is there something in our evolution, in the way we evolved to think, to be like, fear was a lifesaver? We needed that to stay sharp, to stay vigilant, to progress. Is that why we are afraid of the dark? Is that what happens?
I think I think evolutionary psychology can tell a very plausible story on this. A lot of I mentioned kind of very much in passing earlier, there's a range of cognitive biases that we all have, that can kind of basically, derail our thinking on things. And it's pretty widely accepted that, I mean, there's a best-selling book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow.
Okay.
And the idea is that we've got these two different modes of thought available to us, sometimes called System 1 and System 2. System 1 is very, very fast. It's intuitive. Well, you can think of it as being intuition, if you like. It's very, very fast. It's non-conscious. It's not effortful. It's driven by emotion. It's got a whole range of other characteristics. So a typical example of System 1 thinking might be you've just been introduced to someone for the first time and you very quickly decide whether or not you like them. You probably couldn't even put into words why you feel like that. I mean, later on you can come up with some rationalization, but you've instantly decided. System 2 thinking is much slower. It's step by step. It's rational, logical. Again, you think of it as rationality, basically. It's not driven so much by emotion and so forth. So obviously, if I was to give you a mental puzzle to solve and you had to kind of think through the steps in your head, you'd be aware that you were doing it and checking it and so on. So there'd be kind of two prime examples of System 1 and System 2. Now, in terms of our evolutionary history, our brains evolved to keep us alive long enough to pass our genes on to the next generation. Our brains did not evolve to allow us to apprehend the truth with a capital T about the universe, and so obviously, if you think about our evolutionary history, for most of that time, there were predators, there were enemies, there were dangers in the world around us, and it paid to rely more on System 1 thinking, which works via heuristics, kind of quick and dirty rules of thumb that usually give the right answer but are not guaranteed to do so, rather than relying on the slower System 2, which might give the correct answer more often, but it takes longer to get there. So it's a kind of speed-accuracy trade-off, you know? And everybody always gives the same example. There's a rustling in the bushes, Is it a saber-toothed tiger or isn't it? If you just assume based on System 1 thinking that it is and get the hell out of there, you'll survive to pass your genes on. Whereas if you're too slow in making the decision, you might end up as lunch. So we have a bias towards this kind of System 1 thinking, and that means we have a bias towards thinking that there probably is something there, a potential threat, rather than there isn't, And that, it kind of explains a lot of these biases. There's, we're very good at seeing meaning and significance, pattern finding in what's going on all around us. And again, it's a fantastic skill. It's why we are as successful as we are as a species, but we overplay it. We sometimes think we're seeing meaning and patterns and cause and effect relationships when they're not really there. But it makes more sense for us to think that there might be something there. I mean, we can always try and check it out more slowly later, but to assume there might be something there. Another bias is called, sometimes it's called agenticity, whereby if something happens in the world around us, our default position is to assume that someone or something made it happen with specific intentions towards us. And again, in terms of that evolutionary history, that makes sense. If there's a noise in the night, it could be a threat. Assume that it is, you're going to stay alive that way. So I think that goes quite a long way. And again, your example of, being afraid of the dark.
Yeah.
In the dark, there are dangers. There are potential dangers, particularly in terms of our prior evolutionary history.
I mean, we joke about it. We mock it sometimes. We make light of it because it is a bit amusing to those that don't believe. We think, why are people afraid of certain things? For example, the fear of the number 13, triskaidekaphobia.
Hey.
We think that took me such a long time to memorize that.
I'm impressed.
Second time I said it right. Thank you so much, Chris. But for example, that fear, I didn't know how prevalent it was until I realized that it's actually embedded into our society. University institutions of education don't have a 13th floor often.
Yeah.
At the fear of that, and it boggles my mind. For example, the London Wheel doesn't have a 13th pod. They purposely, because they knew the ones that would be on that pod would be panicking galore.
I'm not sure, again, I mean, again, being a kind of, sometimes taking my skepticism to ridiculous extents, I'd have probably paid extra to go.
You'd be the same, yes.
I'll walk under ladders just to,
yes.
So, I mean, again, which is equally irrational, obviously. But yeah, no, I mean, you're right. I mean, in other cultures, of course, they have, it's different numbers that are the lucky and the unlucky ones. I mean, in actual facts, I mean, again, with all of those kind of traditional superstitions, there's no evidence that there's any truth in any of them, but the belief in the superstition, that can potentially have real outcomes, you know. And again, a lot of superstitious thinking, there's a kind of, I think we've all got that inclination. I mean, maybe there are a few people that don't, but I think to be human is to have that kind of, there's an irrational side to all of us, and I kind of celebrate that. I quite like irrational stuff, I like surrealism and all kinds of weird stuff. But even like somebody, I mean, again, this is an anecdote from the book, but when I very, very, very first time I ever appeared on TV, a little bit nervous, one of those daytime audience discussion programs that used to be very popular. And I was getting dressed and I decided I'd put on red socks because I knew that it was the very aggressive presenter that used to be on Newsnight and then University Challenge. His name's gone out of my head. You know what I mean, though, don't you?
I know exactly what you're talking about, yeah.
He was famous for wearing red socks.
Yes,
so I thought, well, if it's good enough for him, it makes him very confident, I'll do it as well. And the show was fine. And then the next time I was due to be on, I found myself rooting around for these red socks. I'm supposed to be the skeptic here, I thought, don't be ridiculous. What socks you wear are not going to make any difference. but that inclination is there for all of us, I think.
I'm exactly the same as yourself. I pride myself to be a skeptic. This chain, I won't do an episode unless I got this chain on.
Yeah,
exactly the same
and
thing.
I get that.
But there's one word that really, really gets under my skin. It's called coincidence.
All right, yes.
Can you explain to us the magic that is coincidence?
Well, again, the whole psychology of coincidences is a fascinating topic. And it's fascinating, particularly when we come to thinking about paranormal belief, because one of the kind of obvious counter explanations from a skeptic when somebody reports their ostensibly paranormal experience might be, well, maybe that was just a coincidence.
Yeah.
So, we might be talking about somebody who's had a dream that then a couple of days later something happens in real life that seems to correspond to the dream. Or it might be, in the olden days, before we could all see who was calling us on our phones just by looking at them, people would sometimes say that even though they weren't expecting a call from somebody, the phone rang and they knew it was that person. It was called telephone telepathy.
Yes, yeah.
And again, lots of people have had those experiences, Now, again, as I say, the skeptics might just say, well, yeah, maybe it was just a coincidence. But coincidence does not feel like a very satisfactory explanation for lots of people. And I can understand why, because it's one of those things where when that kind of thing happens, whether you're a believer or a skeptic, it has an emotional impact. And so when, some smarty pants skeptic tries to just dismiss it as, oh, it was just a coincidence, you kind of might want to hit them, But very often, if you take a step back and think about it, and we take about the example of dreams that foretell the future, so-called precognitive dreams, then there are over 8 billion of us on the planet. And even if we just make the fairly conservative estimate that maybe most people remember one dream per night, then that's over 8 million opportunities for something to happen in a dream that then corresponds to a future event. And it's therefore extremely likely to happen. You can't, say who it's going to happen to, but if it happens to be you that it happens to, it's got this huge emotional impact. And it's very hard then to think that, oh, that was just a coincidence. No, it seems like it was some kind of glimpse into the future. And again, it's what mathematicians call the law of very large numbers.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm right in saying that the chances of winning the jackpot in the national lottery in the UK are 1 in 45 million. But we're not surprised when people do win because we know so many people buy tickets.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that in that context, we don't have any trouble, accepting that, that's going to happen. But you kind of, it's exactly the same in terms of the logic of the situation when people report having these dreams.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a whole load of other factors that could come into play. Very often people report that they have a dream of someone dying and wake up the next morning and they get a phone call saying that person's passed away in the night.
Yeah.
But very often they knew that person was ill anyway. And so the reason they had the dream was that they were worrying about them. And, that's why it's happened. So, but I mean, again, it is really interesting. And the thing is, we should pay attention to those. They may not be coincidences. This is the thing, and it's this kind of, we are built to spot those kind of correspondences, to pick up on those possible connections. And it's only if once we think we've spotted something, we then think it through and we can't think of any possible reason why that should be related to that we might say, maybe it was just a coincidence. But for some people, they're going to say, well, maybe it wasn't. Maybe there was some kind of spooky psychic link there.
Of course.
And the number of people, the number of names that go through your head in a day.
Yeah.
And either nobody calls you at the time when you're thinking about them or somebody calls into a different person. You don't even notice that. It's a non-event. But if you're thinking about somebody that you've maybe not thought about for a while and the phone goes and it's them, wow, that's
dun, 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 dun.
Yeah. And again, another possibility there is what we call hidden causes. And I think the hypothetical example I use when I'm doing talks on this stuff, supposing you get a call, you're just thinking about a long lost friend from college days that you've not seen for decades, and the phone goes and it's them. Wow, amazing. What you've forgotten by then is that on the previous night's news, there was a story about some aging rock star who'd been taken into hospital, and you used to love that band. You used to go and see them with your mate, and you next day you're still kind of thinking over the nostalgia, all those great times you had together, and you've been meaning to get in touch with them, and you've not got around to it. Well, they have just beaten you to it, but you've both forgotten by then why you were thinking about each other.
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's incredible. We're so built to look for the pattern.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's a strength. It's a strength, but we overplay it.
We overplay.
It. Yeah.
How does it play in terms of OCDs, obsessive compulsive disorders?
That's a really interesting question because it looks on the surface as if it's a very similar thing to the kind of superstitious thinking that we're talking about. It's not really clear whether it is or there isn't. I think to some extent it is connected, but certainly some people who suffer from OCD would say, no, it's not the same thing. I'm aware of the fact that I do both. I've got my superstitious thinking over here, but then the obsessive compulsions, that's a separate, different thing. And so I say the jury's out on that one.
The jury's out.
Yeah. I think there is an overlap personally, but
100% it has to be.
I would have thought so.
I wasn't aware of this phenomenon, if you can call it, until my friends at work told me. A little shout out to Z and Mikey. They told me about something called sleep paralysis.
I love sleep paralysis. I don't love having it, but I love talking about it.
I didn't know anything about this. I didn't even know this was a thing until I started to talk to more people about it. And funny enough, I spoke to someone about it who wasn't aware and had never even spoken about it, and then said, Sonny, stop. I go through this, and I was too embarrassed to tell anybody, but this actually happens to me.
See, that's a prime example of where I think you can be reassuring to that person.
Yeah.
I mean, just for the benefit of any listeners who don't know what sleep paralysis is, in its most basic form, it is simply what it says on the tin. It's a temporary period of paralysis, typically lasts a few seconds, and it occurs between sleep and wakefulness, either as you're drifting off into sleep or as you're coming out of sleep. And if that's all you get, then you'd probably just think, oh, that was a bit weird. I don't know what that was about, but it maybe wouldn't be too distressing. But it can be associated with other symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying.
Yes.
And the typical list of symptoms include things like a very strong sense of presence. Even if you can't see or hear anything else, you are sure there is something or someone in the room with you. Typically you're lying there in bed, you can't move, and there's something in there that has evil intentions towards you. But you might actually hallucinate stuff. So you might see lights moving around the room, or dark shadows, or even monstrous figures, demons, old hags, anything that your imagination can dream up. Often there's a sense of pressure on the chest. You have difficulty breathing. You might feel like you've been strangled, or, and intense fear. And, you might say, well, the intense fear is just a perfectly reasonable reaction to all this other stuff.
Sure.
But it's speculated that the amygdala, the part of the brain that deals with the fight or flight mechanism in response to threat, is kind of overly activated during these experiences. So people who've been in genuine life-threatening situations in real life say that the fear they experience during sleep paralysis is orders of magnitude greater than that. It's kind of, really, really the worst thing they've ever experienced. And
so why, Chris?
Well, in terms of, I think we've got the explanation for that one in at least broad brushstroke terms. If you go through a normal night's sleep, then you go about every 90 minutes or so, you go through a particular cycle whereby you first of all go into stage 1 sleep, stage 2 sleep, stage 3 sleep. As you go through these stages, your breathing rate changes, your heart rate changes, your brain waves change in very obviously recognizable ways. And then you come back up through those and you go into what's called REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And that's the phase of sleep which is typically associated with vivid dreams. And while you're in that state, the muscles of your body are actually paralyzed, presumably to stop you acting out the actions of the dream.
Yeah.
But something goes a little bit skew-whiff during an episode of sleep paralysis. And to put it simply, it's as if your brain wakes up, but your body doesn't.
Okay.
So you can open your eyes and you can move your eyes. That's one of the few parts of your body that you can move. So you can see you're in your bedroom. You can't move. And you might have all this weird dream imagery coming through into normal waking consciousness. And as I say, the end result can be absolutely terrifying. I get sent lots of first-hand accounts.
Oh, really?
And there's a whole chapter in the book which includes a lot of those first-hand accounts. And these are from people who have decided for themselves that it wasn't real, it was a hallucination, but still reading them, you think, oh my God, that's terrifying, because it feels real while it's happening. And of course, a lot of people have never heard of sleep paralysis. You mentioned you're somebody you spoke to there. And very often when I've done talks and mentioned sleep paralysis, somebody's come up at the end and said precisely that. I've had that experience. I've never told anybody because I thought they would think I was crazy. Yeah. And indeed they might. This is why I want to get the word out there. It's not that it's some kind of paranormal event. It's not demons. It's not ghosts. It's not UFOs. It's not aliens. It's this thing called sleep paralysis. It can be absolutely terrifying, but it is a hallucinatory experience. Okay. And as I say, absolutely fascinating what people can dream up.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. Are any certain type of people more susceptible to this? For example, are more religious people susceptible to it?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. No, it doesn't seem to be. One of the really interesting things is looking at the way that different cultures around the world interpret what appears to be the same core experience, because then their kind of wider belief system, including their religious beliefs, will come into play. So, you might kind of experience the particular demons that your religion says exist. See, and you get this interesting thing where there's certain themes that seem to recur quite often, even from people who've never spoken to anybody else about it or heard about it before. The old hag is a really common one. In Newfoundland, they talk about the old hag who comes and sits on the sleeper's chest and tries to throttle them. They call it being hag-ridden. If I want a little bit for Harry Potter fans there.
Nice.
But again, like in Japan, they call it kanashibari. That literally translates as bound by iron. One of my favorites is from St. Lucia because it's just so creepy. They interpret the same court experience as being the spirits of unbaptized children that crawl onto the sleeper's chest and throttle them. Nice. Back in the Middle Ages, it was the incubus and the succubus. These were sex-crazed demons. The incubus was the male, succubus was the female. They would come and have their wicked way with you while you were asleep, and you couldn't move,
Wow.
And, and there's interesting parallels there then with because sleep paralysis seems to be a factor in UFO abduction experiences.
Yes.
Back in the Middle Ages, the idea was that the succubus would come and have sex with a sleeping male and kind of take the sperm and then transform into the incubus, the male demon, and use that sperm to impregnate demonically some poor helpless female, And now with the UFOs, you've got the same kind of idea that there's this sinister crossbreeding project going on. Yeah.
You got to give it to them. The creativity is amazing.
Absolutely. It is. I mean, it's where these things come from, because it's, on the one hand, you got those kind of common themes, but you also get a huge amount of idiosyncrasy.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my students who suffered from sleep paralysis on a fairly regular basis, he was telling me about one of his experiences where he woke up and there was a black cat by the side of the bed hissing at him. And obviously he couldn't move, so that's pretty creepy in the first place. But it wasn't an ordinary black cat. Instead of an ordinary cat's head, it had an inverted cat's skull.
Oh my
and
God.
Black goo was dripping from the mouth. If I saw a surrealist painting of that, I think that's somebody who needs treatment.
100%.
And this is a guy who's just an ordinary guy, but he bubbled up from somewhere. And
like for him, this is to your point. I believe these people.
Oh yeah,
I believe they saw what they think they saw.
Yeah, and they're happy to accept that it wasn't real; it was a hallucination. But of course, there'll be loads of other people who won't bother trying to get in touch with a scientist who studies this stuff. They'll go to their local priest or imam or whoever because they will, and often they will end up being told, yes, it was a demon. It was, and maybe even end up having to go through some sort of exorcism route.
Exactly, yeah. When really, instead of an exorcist, all you need was a skeptic.
Exactly, yeah.
To the house.
Yeah, exactly.
I've had my own experience of a paranormal, for example, experience. And it's quite embarrassing because I was the guy that was constantly preaching that none of this is real, none of this is real. So what happened was, in the evening, I went to sleep and somebody pushed past my bed. Mm-hmm. My bed shook. And it was enough for me to get out of bed and say, what was that? Something just happened. So I go up to the landing of the stairs. I have a look around. And then my sister down the hall started screaming. I ran into her room and I said, what's happened? And she said, he's under my bed. As soon as she said that, I thought a burglar. Someone's jumped in the window, my bedroom, and they got under the bed. So I lifted up her bed. Nothing's there. Now, my dad, who was watching TV downstairs with my mom, he came running up the stairs and he said, where is he? What, we heard someone run up the stairs as well. And so we've all congregated now into the kitchen, gone downstairs, and we're all under the assumption that, okay, if we can't see no one here, all the windows are fine, none of the doors are open, it must have been a ghost. We all unilaterally agreed it's a ghost. Now, I don't believe anything. My mom doesn't believe anything. My sister's near here or there. My dad's a true believer.
Right.
And my dad said, it's that ghost. I seen one of these in India. He started telling us stories. Now, Chris, I don't believe in any of this, but at that moment, I will hold my hand up, Chris. I was convinced to the point where I believe I could even smell sulfur. Now, in some sort of I don't know, I watched some movie where they said, oh, a demon smells like sulfur and this. And I was like, can you smell that, guys? Oh, it's very cold all of a sudden. Until I got a text on my phone. And I read the text. It was from a friend who said, "Oh, did you feel that earthquake?"
Oh, nice.
That's all it was. It was a small tremor, but enough to wake me up.
I thought you were going to throw that at me at the end of the story and say, "Go and explain that one." And I was going to have to say, "Oh, well, I don't know. But I mean, it might have just maybe you had sleep paralysis and it was coincidence." but no, you actually got the explanation yourself.
There you go. And like what I can say firsthand, why I've got so much empathy for people that have got these experiences. I always say to them now, I say, I believe you. I truly believe you think you saw what you saw, but I believe there's an alternative explanation.
Yeah. Well, again, very often, just because you can't think of an explanation doesn't mean there isn't one.
Yes.
Again, my kind of favourite example that I'm always trotting out in talks, this goes back to probably about 4 or 5 years ago now. There was a story in the press about a guy who he had a little shed, little workshop where he'd go and he'd tinker about all day. He was very messy. He'd leave all his stuff out on his workbench. He'd lock up, go indoors, go to bed, come back out the next morning, open up, and everything had been put away. And he could not figure out what was going on. This was going on for months. Like a kind of an anti-poltergeist, who kind of tidies up for you rather than chuck stuff around, And in the end, with a neighbour, they thought they were going to get to the bottom of this. They set up a video camera, and it was a little mouse. A little house-proud mouse would appear and just pick all these bits. Sometimes, quite just weighty tools, but drag them all, put them back in his box on his... And again, if a skeptic had put that forward as an explanation, you'd have been laughed at, quite rightly, understandably.
Would not believe that until you saw the footage.
Because we've got the footage. And the footage is on YouTube. You can go away and you'll be able to track that down. So again, I kind of like to show that in the talks because all the audience will go, oh, isn't it cute? But again, just because you cannot think of an explanation does not mean there isn't one. I mean, that was a nice example as well with all the kind of 3 different people. Yeah, 3 independent witnesses, 100%. All something weird went on.
Yeah.
And yes, it did. Yeah.
So you touched upon the power of suggestibility and how powerful that can be. If someone is susceptible to these kind of things and someone that does believe and wants to believe, and then they have a near-death experience, is it more likely that they're going to think they saw something, do you think?
Well, I mean, a near-death experience is it is a very profound experience. And, it's life-transforming for lots of people. And again, this can happen to atheists as well as believers, The typical kind of, what the kind of things that people report with near-death experiences is often they report an out-of-body experience. Initially, they'll report maybe they either can look down and see themselves on an operating table, or it might be a scene of a crash and they seem to be above it looking down at the emergency workers trying to rescue them and so on, or resuscitate and so on and so forth. And then they'll often report going down a tunnel towards a bright light. Sometimes they're accompanied, or it feels like they're being accompanied by spiritual guides. Sometimes they'll have a life review process where, people say, oh, your life flashes before you.
Before your eyes, yeah.
And yes, it really does happen. People report that.
Okay.
And it's kind of as if it's kind of non-judgmental, but all the kind of important points of their life. It happens very, very quickly.
Yeah.
But, and sometimes they'll end up in some kind of idyllic place. It might be a kind of beautiful crystalline city or a beautiful garden or whatever else it may be. Or very often they will report coming to some kind of a barrier. Might be a wall, might be a gate, might be a river, and then they'll maybe hear a voice saying, your time isn't now. And then they're back in their bodies.
Yeah.
And often, particularly if they've been in an accident or something, they've gone from this idyllic, happy state to a body that's racked by pain, and they're back in the real world now. But the transformation that it can bring about in their everyday lives is that they often become much less materialistic, much more kind of spiritual, much more caring about other people and about the environment. So they become kind of better people.
Yeah.
Having said that, it can be really difficult because living with a saint can be quite difficult. So there's a high divorce rate. You kind of, it's a situation, you come home and, hey, I've sold the house and given all the money to charity. Yeah. Oh, that's great.
Thanks.
And other issues they have is kind of just in terms of trying to describe what it was like to other people, because it's got this ineffable quality. They can't put it into words. And it's only other people who've had a similar experience that they feel they can communicate with. You also, I mean, most near-death experiences are positive, but there's a subset that are negative. And that's really fascinating. There's kind of 3 different types. There's one which is essentially very similar to the positive thing, except that the person who's having the experience thinks, pardon my French, oh shit, that means I'm dead.
Yeah.
And they're not too happy about it. There's another one which sounds ridiculous, but people do report it. It's almost like a kind of Hieronymus Bosch version of hell, with demons and people being tortured over fires and pitchforks and what have you. Sounds ludicrous, but people say, I know it felt ridiculous. It felt like a pantomime, but that's what I experienced. But the one that really sends shivers down my spine is people reporting that they found themselves in this infinite void with no sensation, no colour, no nothing. Maybe sometimes they'll have a clock ticking and they know they're going to be there for eternity. And that is just,
perhaps that's the true hell.
And then, maybe. And then, obviously, whereas for people who have the positive experience, it makes them much less afraid of dying. But people who have the negative experience become much more frightened of dying. Can actually have PTSD as a result of this.
Well, I bring this up because I've had a near-death experience, and I was 17 years old, so I wasn't particularly young. I was enough to remember, and I've spoken to other people about their experiences, and the people that I've spoken to, other people, and they're both very, very much in the belief of things. For example, they're very open to, demons and this and that. And their experiences, one saw light. He said it was an overwhelming amount of light. And he said, I had an inclination to go towards the light. I needed to go. And then by then I was awake. I was resuscitated. I said, okay. And a girl who I'd spoken to, for example, she saw the exact same thing, which was people being tortured and all sorts.
Right. So she had a negative?
She had a negative one. And when she came to, like you said, she changed her way of life.
Right.
Myself, Chris, I was drowning. And I thought I could swim, but I couldn't. And then I went in the deep end and I started drowning. And then cut a long story short, I blacked out. I know it went all dark and I blacked out. The next thing I know, I saw yellow, someone coming towards me, and I wanted it to be something super, paranormal or whatever, until I came out the water and I was dropped on the cold tiles. And when I looked up, the lifeguard had a yellow t-shirt on, and instantly I snapped out of it and I was like, he just saved my life. I was just drowning, and it all kind of came to. That was my near-death experience. Right. But I was very close to, and I was very.
And if he'd have not rescued you, who knows what?
Or if had it been another second later, maybe I would have.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So that makes me wonder: are people that are a little bit more susceptible to that kind of thought and open towards
this? I mean, it's possible that there are differences there. I mean, it's a very, very difficult kind of subject to study, as you might imagine, because you can't bring people into the laboratory and bring them near to death. The ethics committee just won't allow it. I know.
They won't allow that. Yeah,
I haven't. But there are ways. Obviously, you can collect accounts from people. There's also been a trend to do what are called prospective studies, where people who've had a heart attack and been taken into hospital, where obviously they might have another heart attack, and so that you can be ready to interview them as soon as they're in a fit state to be interviewed.
Okay.
So you're less likely to get distorted memories because you're there. So there are ways of kind of trying to get at it. I mean, without going into details, because it does get rather complicated, but there are, I would say, plausible but not proven neuropsychological explanations for what's going on.
Okay.
And in particular, the temporal lobes of the brain seem to be crucially involved. Now, there's a big debate within the literature. A lot of near-death experience researchers do tend to kind of go for the spiritual explanations. They see it as evidence of possibly a glimpse of the afterlife, but certainly as evidence that consciousness, the mind, the soul, whatever you want to call it, can leave the physical body and become separated from it. Whereas there's an opposing camp who believe that basically it's often summarized as being the visions of a dying brain. There's weird stuff going on in your brain in that situation, and that's what it feels like to you while that's happening. And in fact, you don't even, and this is a challenge to both sides, that you don't actually physically need to be near death. As long as you think you're near death,
that's interesting.
You can still sometimes have these experiences. But it basically would often be explained by the skeptics in this situation as being it's about kind of cortical disinhibition, and as I say, this is how it feels.
Yeah.
And another big question that's often raised, particularly by the people who go for the spiritualist interpretation, is how is it that people can have such a rich experience? The way they'll present it is to say when they're clinically brain dead. Well, first off, we don't know when they're having the experience. It might be when they're going into that state or when they're coming out of it. And also, it's very rare actually for people to be connected up to an EEG machine while they're having this.
Yeah.
There are cases where it's happened. And even then, there could still be a lot of activity subcortically, which could be responsible. I mean, I would not say that we have a kind of totally definitive non-paranormal account of the near-death experience. If I had to bet my money, I would bet on the side of it being a rich and profound hallucinatory experience. Obviously, other people will look at the accounts and they'll come to different conclusions. We do know that people often the accounts that get all of the attention and get the documentaries made about them are those where it is at least reported as if people have had an out-of-body experience and they've picked up information from remote locations accurately and so on and so forth. Often when you dig a little bit deeper, those cases are not quite as impressive as they're presented. But we certainly know that often people report things that are not accurate. They report meeting kind of large insects and all kinds of weird stuff. So at least some of this is hallucinatory. We know that at least some of it is, and I think the burden of proof is on those who say, well, yeah, but some of it isn't.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And the other kind of thing I'd add on that is that in terms of whether or not it is a genuinely paranormal experience that could not be explained in terms of, conventionally accepted scientific concepts, I think the thing to focus on would be the out-of-body experience.
Okay.
Because although, as I say, to actually study near-death experiences while they are happening is very, very difficult indeed for obvious reasons. But there are some people who claim that they can have an out-of-body experience more or less at will, just by engaging in various mental exercises. Now, if just one of those people could come and sit in that chair that you're sitting in now, go into that state, and then tell me what's on the table in your kitchen.
That would be such an easy experiment.
Such an easy experiment. We need one person to do it.
I'll write something on a piece of paper over there.
And the skeptics have lost.
There we go.
That's it. It would completely blow the skeptics out of the water. And yet that's not happened.
Wow.
So
now we could do an entire whole podcast on psychedelics and on how that affects and what that can do.
When you say do the podcast on psychedelics,
that would be a very interesting podcast. Yeah. But like that subject, that I've never done them myself, but I know some. You've never done them yourself, have you? But like, it's such fascinating that the stories that you hear from people that have taken them, for example, ayahuasca, that's just such a profound experience that people go through. How is that neurologically? How does that affect people in terms of like, people have done those, which I can understand. You consume something and it alters your mind. Understand. How come it changes them completely after when they come off the trip, for example? And
I think it can be similar to kind of a near-death experience in the sense of you feel that you have experienced a really deep and profound truth that maybe you can't put into words. It's that ineffability angle again. And there's been a real resurgence of interest in psychedelics in recent years, and some really interesting research being done. And it appears that it increases the interconnectivity between different parts of the brain. I mean, your brain is, constantly, there are parts that are kind of connected and talking to each other. There are other parts that are inhibited while that's going on, and there's a constantly changing pattern. But there seems to be a massive increase in kind of connectivity between different areas of the brain. And essentially, what the kind of psychedelic experience is what it's like to be on the inside of that while it's happening. Now, I don't know whether this is kind of maybe too simplistic, because I mean, people, I know lots of people who kind of have a very hands-on interest in this area of research, and they would be kind of convinced that the things they've experienced while they've been in that state are, true in a very deep and profound sense. And if you've never had the experience, which, like I say, I haven't, you probably could never really appreciate it. But my kind of maybe more simplistic attitude is, if you've got something that is screwing around with the brain's natural neurochemistry, is that really likely to kind of be a door to this kind of doors of perception, as Aldous Huxley would have put it? It give you a more accurate view of the way the universe works. And there's a part of me that thinks, well, no, it probably wouldn't, because it's screwing up the way that your brain's supposed to work. But again, I could be wrong. And I mean, again, I used to say to my students, I hadn't talked about in the context of psychedelics, but I used to say, if I come in next week and say I've had a near-death experience, and I now realise that all that other stuff I was telling you is all wrong, you should not believe it just because it's me that's saying it.
Yeah,
it doesn't. I mean, there is a famous instance of a philosopher who was a very, very outspoken skeptic, Freddie Ayer, Ayer, who had a near-death experience, so the classic near-death experience, and he was initially kind of really flummoxed by it. But then, after a few days of thinking about it, decided that it was a hallucinatory experience. And the people on the other side of the debate, the ones who go for the spiritual, say, look, even when a skeptic has the experience themselves, they're not convinced. I think that's perfectly rational on his part. But and for a while, obviously, because it is an amazing experience, as is taking psychedelics. But I've never gone down that route myself.
Never gone down. Me too. I'm one of those. I'm too terrified to lose control.
I think I'm probably the same.
I'm the same, yeah. Is there anything, now that we're talking about minds and like enlightenment, is there any exercises we can do? Maybe not so much as like a physical exercise, but is there something we can do to help us mentally for people that may be going through these kind of things, or people that are afraid of certain things? Is there something we can do?
Well, I'm the first thing to say is I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I can make a few kind of general comments, perhaps, but I sometimes get kind of emails from people. Sometimes it's people saying that they've got amazing abilities. That's always kind of really interesting. But I also sometimes get people who are distressed. There's stuff going on and they can't make sense of it, and they're frightened. And I just have to say, look, unless if it's a really kind of classic example of sleep paralysis, then I feel I can kind of help them just by saying, this is what this sounds like to me. I can send you some literature on it, some papers. It could be a terrifying experience, but it's not real.
Yeah.
And often just finding that out can be enough to reduce the anxiety, and that makes you actually, if anything that disturbs your sleep will make it more likely that you'll have an episode of sleep paralysis if you've got the underlying susceptibility. Okay. So whether it be just that you're kind of very anxious and you won't go to sleep because you're frightened that you're going to have another episode, or whether it's you're a shift worker, or it's jet lag, or a whole host of other things, a baby crying all night. But I feel I can kind of help those people, because I think I can recognize what this is, and it's this thing, and we know a lot about it. And as you said before, a lot of the time people have never heard of it. And even medical professionals have never heard of it. So people go and see their GP. I had one case of somebody who got in touch, and she'd plucked up the courage. She'd realised it was sleep paralysis. She'd plucked up the courage to ask her GP, is there anything, get any advice? And he just looked at her. He just said, I've never heard of that. And just, completely dismissed her. I was so cross. I was so
I would be furious, 100%.
But, I mean, apart from that, you see, I suppose I'd be more about kind of encouraging people to do a bit more critical thinking, I suppose, is the bottom line,
Yeah.
And again, with some of these experiences, it's not that easy. If it's something that really was, you can't always think of an explanation for these things.
Yeah.
And it's, and particularly if you've grown up in a family or a community where everybody accepts this stuff as real, it's quite a leap, quite brave to get to a point where you kind of start expressing any doubts about it.
For sure. I was very excited to find out that you've actually got a new book coming out.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, we say coming out. I've not actually written a word of it yet. I've got approval. This is something which will be a kind of quite slim volume. There's a lot of these kind of essential guides to and that kind of thing. It'll be in that kind of line. Very slim volume on false and recovered memories, kind of is what science says about. It's a series that Columbia University Press are bringing out. And I'll be doing one in that series on false and recovered memories.
I'm so excited for that.
I've got a year to write it, so I'd better start.
Yeah. Now that I've put it out there,
it's the pressure on.
No pressure, Chris. Sorry about that. Chris, thank you so much for joining us. This has been such an eye-opener in your fascinating world. Please, you are welcome back anytime to enlighten me once again.
Thank you very much.
Before we go, Chris, can you tell everyone where can they find you? Where can they buy your book, for example?
Well, the book is on Amazon and this is available from other providers. You don't have to go to Satan's own website. And it's also available as an audiobook. In terms of, I do have a website. It's profchrisfrench.com. I am terrible when it comes to updating websites, and I've not updated that for such a long time, but I should do that. So, yeah, and basically, if you go there, there are kind of, you'll be able to download some of the publications that we've had over the years. There are video clips from various things, etc. There's a lot of stuff there, basically.
Are you still okay with people emailing you, for example, if they have sleep paralysis and they want to talk about it?
Yeah, as I say, I mean, often, if it's not an obvious case of sleep paralysis, I often just end up replying saying, look, I'm not a clinical psychologist. And maybe I might be able to kind of refer them on to somebody who does have the required expertise. But if it's sleep paralysis, and I love just getting people's first-hand accounts of sleep paralysis or out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences, all of those things, because if you're ever writing something, I think it really brings it to life
100%.
when you've got those kind of first-hand accounts in there. So if you've had the weird experiences,
get in touch.
Let me know.
100%. And false memories might help your new book.
Yeah.
So there you have it, guys. If you have any false memories, if you have any first-hand accounts of out-of-body experiences, please contact Chris. Thank you so much once again, Chris.
Okay, great.
Take care.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.